The towering factories that once churned out the machines of war now stand silent, abandoned. In the summer of 1945, the collapse of Nazi Germany left behind sprawling industrial complexes filled with half-built tanks, unused machinery, and a shattered workforce. The once feared Panzer factories, vital to the Third Reich's war effort, had no purpose in a world that was rebuilding from the ashes of destruction. What happened to these colossal structures? Some were dismantled, others repurposed for civilian use, and many simply abandoned. Their fate mirrored the uncertainty of post-war Europe, a fractured landscape struggling to redefine itself after the horrors of the war. The factories that once roared to life producing the machines of war now stood eerily silent. At the end of May 1945, the Third Reich collapsed, and with it, a sprawling network of industrial sites designed to create the most advanced war machines of the era. Among these, the German tank factories were among the most pivotal. They had been the beating heart of the Wehrmacht's armored forces, pumping out some of the most fearsome machines ever built. Yet, by the summer of 1945, these same factories had no purpose. No orders. No plans. Only a staggering mass of unused equipment, half-finished tanks, and vast amounts of scrap metal. The cessation of hostilities had left a world with a deep, unspoken uncertainty. Europe was broken, and the economy, now strained by the war's burden, had to reset itself. The factories that had once been the locus of German industrial might now stood as colossal symbols of wartime excess and destruction. The German tank manufacturing plants, scattered across former Third Reich territories, were no longer a cornerstone of military might. They had become a problem, a monumental problem at that. In the months following the war's end, decisions were made with one clear priority: dismantle, disarm, and repurpose. The Allied powers, particularly the Soviets and Americans, were keen on preventing any resurgence of Germany's military strength. The factories were not simply abandoned, they were systematically decommissioned. The machinery within them was deemed surplus and, in many cases, obsolete. Steel for tanks could no longer be directed toward weapons. Instead, it was redirected to rebuilding civilian infrastructure, often on a much-needed and much smaller scale. The German tank industry had been concentrated in several major centers, with significant hubs in Nuremberg, Pilsen, and the Ruhr Valley. These locations had housed the production of the iconic Panzer tanks, including the formidable Tiger and Panther models, as well as a range of other vehicles. By 1945, many of the factories that produced these tanks were already in disarray. The factory complexes had been damaged by bombing campaigns, and many production lines were no longer functional. In some places, large sections of the workforce had either perished or fled. In the immediate aftermath of the war, a number of these factories, still standing in a state of ruin, were seized by the Allies. The process of dismantling Germany's war machine began in earnest. The equipment inside the plants, much of it still capable of production, was often disassembled and shipped to the victor's own countries for study or sent to be scrapped. The Allies had little use for such industrial behemoths, and their presence, now obsolete, was seen as a reminder of the destructive power Germany had once wielded. In 1945 alone, hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles, most of them in various stages of production, were either disassembled or destroyed. The scale of this dismantling was staggering. Official reports show that over 8,000 tanks were taken to scrapyards across Europe in the immediate post-war years. These weren't just the finished products. The factories contained incomplete hulls, spare parts, and entire production lines. Workers who had survived the war were put to work disassembling these industrial sites, turning them from places of wartime efficiency into quiet factories of disposal. But dismantling was not the only fate of these sites. In some regions, factories were repurposed for civilian use, though this was far from a universal solution. The Soviets, for example, took possession of a number of factories in eastern Germany and Poland. While some of these facilities were repurposed to manufacture civilian vehicles or machinery, many continued to churn out military equipment, but now for the Soviet war effort. The Soviet Union, which had its own ambitions of rebuilding a military-industrial complex, found value in continuing operations at certain facilities. However, these factories, once the pride of the German war effort, had long lost their prestige. In Western Germany, the story was slightly different. Under the guidance of the Americans and their allies, many of the tank factories were abandoned, left to rot under the pressure of a crumbling post-war economy. The Western Allies, rather than seeking to repurpose them, chose to deindustrialize large parts of the region to ensure that the specter of German militarism would not rise again. The American-run occupation zones saw the destruction of key military-industrial areas, including tank production plants, often to the point of physical eradication. Meanwhile, Germany itself was plunged into the chaos of rebuilding. The German people faced a grim reality in the years following the war. Not only had they lost a war, but their very industries, the ones that had powered their war machine, were now obsolete. This industrial collapse would not only affect the production of military vehicles, but the whole of the German economy, which would struggle for decades to regain its pre-war level of prosperity. With the tanks of the Wehrmacht no longer needed, the factories were left behind as haunting remnants of a military-industrial complex that had led to so much destruction. But the sheer size of the problem was daunting. The tank factories were not small operations. These were immense industrial complexes, often employing thousands of workers and spreading across vast swathes of land. In the wake of the war, some of the largest tank plants were left standing, their steel skeletons looming over empty fields. The workers who had once toiled in these factories were gone. The production lines were still intact, but with no one to operate them. It became a question of what to do with these enormous machines of production, now a symbol of a past best forgotten. In the immediate years following the war, some attempts were made to preserve parts of the industry for future use. The idea of a revived German industry was an optimistic thought, but it was not one that materialized quickly. The Allies had no interest in allowing the rise of another military powerhouse in Europe. The factories, which once symbolized a nation's might, now symbolized its fall. They were left to decay. Some were destroyed outright, others stripped of their equipment, leaving behind a shell of what they had once been. In Eastern Europe, some factories had a different fate. While the Soviets stripped many of the factories in their occupation zones for use in their own economy, others were left to be overrun by time. Without proper care, many of these sites fell into disrepair, as the war had already bled dry much of the region's resources. The few that remained in some capacity, still producing tanks and armored vehicles for Soviet use, did so with far less efficiency and scale than their predecessors had. By the mid-1950s, the landscape of post-war Europe had largely moved on from the remnants of the German war machine. Tanks, factories, and the men who had built them were no longer part of the world's consciousness. The factories, however, stood as silent monuments to the past, reminders of a time when their purpose had been to craft the tools of war. Now, they were nothing more than hollowed-out shells. Some became museums, relics of an era that had been erased. But for the vast majority, they were abandoned, forgotten, or destroyed. What remained was the quiet echo of what had once been a thriving industrial empire, now turned to dust. The decision to abandon, repurpose, or dismantle Germany's tank factories after the war had not been made lightly, yet the consequences of those choices were far-reaching. By the mid-1940s, the Allies had recognized that in order to ensure long-term peace in Europe and prevent the resurgence of a militarized Germany, these industrial sites had to be erased or repurposed. The remnants of the once feared Panzer factories, which had birthed some of the most sophisticated tanks of the war, were now subject to the whims of occupation authorities, economic necessity, and a rapidly changing political landscape. The aftermath of this destruction would leave a long-lasting imprint on the industrial geography of post-war Europe. By 1946, the Soviet Union and the United States, the two principal occupying powers in Germany, had already embarked on the disarmament and deindustrialization of the country. For the Soviets, this process was both punitive and opportunistic. While they sought to eliminate the possibility of German militarism, they also sought to extract as much industrial and technological knowledge as possible. In some instances, the Soviets transported entire production lines back to the USSR. Entire factories, along with their skilled workforce, were uprooted and moved to Soviet territory, particularly in places like Ukraine and Belarus. These plants, though designed to create tanks and military hardware, were retooled for civilian production. The machinery that had once fashioned the deadly Tiger and Panther tanks was now being used to manufacture agricultural equipment or civilian vehicles. This was a highly symbolic process, as it showed how quickly these factories, which had symbolized the destructive power of Nazi Germany, were being reappropriated for a new geopolitical agenda. The factories in Soviet-controlled regions were not the only ones affected by this transformation. In Western Germany, the story unfolded somewhat differently. Here, under the control of the Western Allies, the focus was squarely on ensuring that Germany could never again pose a military threat. The destruction of military-industrial infrastructure was a key part of this effort. For the Americans, the dismantling of tank factories was not just a matter of military necessity but also a way of consolidating control over the region. A decision was made to erase much of Germany's war potential, and so the factories that had once produced tanks and armored vehicles were systematically reduced to rubble. What remained of these once powerful industrial sites were often little more than barren fields. The machinery, which had once churned out tanks by the thousands, was sent to scrapyards. Even if some factories remained intact, their production capacity was entirely gone. Large sections of the workforce, too, had been decimated or displaced. The industrial hubs that had driven Germany's war economy were now shadows of their former selves, and the silence that enveloped them stood as a poignant reminder of the catastrophic toll that war had taken. Yet, even in this post-war desolation, there were efforts to salvage something. In the face of economic collapse and the devastation that had taken hold of Europe, some factories were retooled for civilian use. This was not an easy transition, nor was it always successful. While the American occupation authorities focused on removing any trace of the Nazi military-industrial complex, they were also faced with the necessity of rebuilding a country in ruins. Some of the factories in the western zones of Germany were repurposed for the production of consumer goods, though this process was slow, and the immediate post-war years were marked by scarcity and poverty. The factories, which had been used to produce tanks, were now being adapted to make basic products like household items and industrial machinery. However, the shift from wartime production to civilian manufacturing required a significant reorientation of both the machinery and the workforce. The technical expertise that had gone into creating the perfect war machine had to be redirected towards civilian needs, often without the resources to make this transition smoothly. In addition to the repurposing of some factories, there were also efforts to preserve the industrial heritage that had once defined the German war effort. In the western zones, some sites were preserved as historical monuments, though these efforts were not always successful in the long term. In the wake of the war, there was little room for sentimentality. The priority was survival and rebuilding, not the preservation of a legacy tied to destruction. Still, some of the old factories became museums, housing exhibits about the technological prowess of the German war machine. These sites became ironic monuments to a defeated and fractured nation. They preserved the memory of a war effort that had been vanquished, even as they faded into obscurity. The remnants of these factories, which had been symbols of Nazi might, were now being stripped of their significance, left to decay as relics of a past that had no place in the New World Order. For the Soviet Union, the approach was more methodical and practical. As they continued to extract resources from the German territory, many factories were kept under operation, albeit in a reduced capacity. The process was not one of historical preservation but one of strategic repurposing. The Soviets, in their own pursuit of a military-industrial complex, sought to make use of the German factories in ways that suited their needs. However, the infrastructure in place was often ill-suited to the demands of the Soviet economy. The Germans had built their factories with a level of technological sophistication that was, at times, far ahead of Soviet capabilities. The Soviets could not simply continue operations as they had been. They had to make adjustments, often to the detriment of efficiency. Many factories were either partially dismantled or re-engineered to meet Soviet standards. The Soviets also had to deal with the challenge of integrating German technical expertise into their own systems. The knowledge that the Germans had accumulated in fields like tank production, metallurgy, and industrial engineering was invaluable. It would take years for the Soviet Union to fully integrate this knowledge into their own manufacturing processes, and even longer for the results to be felt on the battlefield. As the years passed, the fate of the abandoned German tank factories began to settle into a predictable pattern. The sites that had once housed the greatest industrial power in Europe were now empty. Where once there had been the hum of machinery and the march of workers, there was only silence. Some factories had been repurposed, but many had been destroyed, their ruins left to fade into the background of a country rebuilding itself from the ground up. The German industrial sector was, by the early 1950s, struggling to regain its former strength. The loss of the tank factories was emblematic of the larger economic struggle Germany faced in the aftermath of the war. With the loss of these critical industrial sites, the country had to start over, learning to produce at a smaller scale and with fewer resources. The scale of the war effort, which had seen the mobilization of virtually every available resource, now seemed a distant memory. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, many of the factories that had once produced tanks and military vehicles were completely gone. Some had been dismantled, their materials repurposed for other uses. Others had been abandoned and left to crumble. The factories that had once symbolized Nazi military power were now little more than a distant memory, replaced by the needs of a new world order. The process of reindustrialization in both East and West Germany had little room for the factories that had once fueled the war effort. What had once been the backbone of Germany's military might was now irrelevant in a new, post-war economy.